Welcome to A Good Man is Hard to Find podcast. As always, we will be discussing what does it mean to be a male lay Catholic leader in response to the modern day church crisis. We'll also talk about why men are worthless, how they can be improved, why Superman was born, and why Batman is a fraud.
Today, we're talking about virtue.
Barnaby, cue the music. Welcome back to A Good Man is Hard to Find podcast. As James and I alluded to in the intro, we will be talking about superheroes tonight. But just to give everyone some context, the reason we wanted to go down that path is because we were moved by something that Aristotle wrote, and he talked about how, most people might think of virtue as being on one end of the spectrum and vice being on the other end of the spectrum, but really vice is on both ends of the spectrum and virtue is somewhere in the middle. Because it's easy for someone to pursue virtue in an overzealous manner or capacity, and then act in a way that is not virtuous. So we thought that that sounds a little idealistic or ethereal or esoteric. There's something about it that it's philosophical, but it doesn't really show or tell what virtue is and what that looks like in practice. And so we figured that we would use superhero movies as an illustration of what virtue looks like in practice. And we thought we want to focus on not so much the superpowers, but more so the motivation or the man, so to speak, the man behind the superpowers or the woman behind the superpowers. Although we're going to be focusing on men, since this is A Good Man is Hard to Find podcast, not a good woman is hard to find, because women are great. So, James,
They are.
Wanna...
Absolutely. Well, and I love that we're talking about superheroes because they're the modern day mythologies. All of the tales of old that we still get excited about making movies about. Well, that's what we've adapted them into our superheroes, and the virtues and vices that underlie these great, powerful beings are the same things that you might see in the gods and goddesses of old. So it's absolutely the connection is clear that if we're going to be talking about virtue, it's a perfect metaphor to use superhero movies. The basis of my argument is, if you look at vice and you look at virtue, there are storytellers that you can think only that virtue is boring and vice is interesting.
But wouldn't you? I don't. So I agree with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I also agree with the perspective of the storytellers, because I think when I just think about people that I know, and even conceptions of virtuous people, the more virtuous someone is, the more often that your average person in society would find them boring, wouldn't you say? So, for example, if you're Catholic and you don't drink too much and you don't really go to bars and you don't go to strip clubs and you spend time in prayer, you spend time reading, you go to work and you work hard, I mean, wouldn't you say that most people would find that individual kind of boring? That's not to say that person doesn't necessarily have a personality, but in terms of a lifestyle, wouldn't you say that would you agree that most people would find that lifestyle somewhat monotonous?
No, actually. Think about it I go back to, I'm quoting G.K. Chesterton here. G.K. Chesterton, an English literary giant, early 1900s, one of my all-time favorites. And he found romanticism in the train arriving to its stop on time and not wrecking and killing hundreds of people. Now, that's a perfect example of what we're trying to say here. If you find something if you see a life that is well lived, that is well loved, and that is full of service in it, there is poetry within that. There is a song within it. And finding that life is something that is appealing.
But I think that, so again, I agree with you, but what you're speaking to by quoting Chesterton and what Chesterton is speaking to in his writings is a proper disposition, or like a well-informed disposition. And where I'm coming from is that I think that most people in today's society, men especially, have an improper disposition or are not well-formed. Thus, these writers are selling something that they believe people want to see because their objective is to make money. And so, and perhaps that's one of the issues with the superhero movies is that, at least to me in modern times, the objective is not to portray virtue. The objective is to sell. And so the question is, what sells? Vice sells because modern men find vice more interesting than they find virtue, which again, I think speaks to the importance of people like Chesterton and what we are endeavoring to do with this podcast. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And I think that is a point that we can totally make, because what is revolt? It is revolting. It's nausea. It's throwing up. What is something that is what we would like? What is something that is attractive? It is that when an organism works properly, when it is actually functioning as it is meant to function. And so when you tell a story and you're able to infuse that understanding of right relationship and virtue between okay, just because there is virtue doesn't mean that there is no conflict. You can have two virtuous characters that are in incredible conflict for us. The latest Avengers movie, Avengers Infinity War, is a perfect example of that. Thanos is a virtuous character.
Well, not in the comic books.
But in the movies he is.
Well, I don't.
Really? Okay, tell me.
See, I guess I don't think that Thanos is virtuous.
Maybe I can state why I think he's virtuous. And then you can...
Well, I don't think anyone who has a desire to kill is someone who is virtuous. Again, I think going back to what we first referenced with Aristotle, that's a level of over-exuberance.
Yes,
So if you want to say that he's well-intended, I might be more inclined to agree with that. Again, how he's portrayed in the movie, not the comic books, because those are two very different concepts. But I would not associate virtue with Thanos.
That's a very good point. Okay. Can you had a list of all the virtues. Let's break them out and let's compare what Thanos has or doesn't have.
So we'll get into the theological virtues a little bit later, because I don't think they're really relevant to this topic. But the primary virtues or the cardinal virtues, or maybe you know them by a different name.
And these are true for everyone. These aren't just Catholic Christians. These are every living being can have these virtues.
Right. So there's 4 of them, and in no particular order, they are fortitude, temperance, prudence, and justice.
Fortitude, temperance, prudence, and justice. Let's take them each one and compare them to Thanos and see what he might have or doesn't have.
Sure, sounds good. Okay. So again, folks, we'll define these how we see them.
Yeah.
These are very crude definitions.
Sure.
They're by no means scholastic or intellectual. So just know that as we have this conversation.
Okay. So justice. Let's start with that one. That's the easiest
Giving
one.
each his or her due.
Giving each his or her due. Do you think Thanos does that?
No.
I agree. 100% agree. His understanding of justice is completely wrong. And you can see that because he doesn't value life. There's a complete disvalue of life, and therefore the justice that he metes out has a complete disregard of it. If you don't value something that is worth something, you cannot, in justice, deal with it. And therefore, he has no ability to deal justly with his fellow man or fellow beings.
Right.
Okay, so he's not just. Prudent.
No.
Ooh, I disagree with this one. Prudence is the ability to see an outcome and then see how one is able to get to that outcome, and be wise in his dealings in order to make that outcome happen.
But see, I guess, and maybe this is where our fundamental disagreement is. Just as you're saying that, what comes to mind for me is that I think virtue inherently implies that there's a pursuit of the good. And so with Thanos, what his end goal is it is not good.
Mm.
So even though he might be able to reason well or put himself in positions where he's able to succeed, because there is no pursuit of the good, I don't like I would not agree that he's virtuous. If there were some, you know what I mean? Because I guess when I think of prudence, I don't have a good definition, but I think a good example would be if you want to wake up at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. to go to the gym and get to mass, etc. You need to make sure that you're in bed by 9 or 10 or 11 p.m. at the latest in order to be able to function well the next day and give your efforts to God, to yourself, and to your job, and to any other person that you interact with throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, prudence is that action of like, I'm going to go to bed on time.
Yes.
And I'm going to go to, and it's not only going to bed on, like, it's not the going to bed on time, it's creating the circumstances to be able to get to bed on time.
Absolutely.
So it's not, I'm going to meet up with a buddy at 8 p.m. for drinks.
100%.
It's saying, no, I'm going to go home and I'm going to brush my teeth and be ready for bed and stay at my apartment so that when 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock comes around, I'm in a position to go to sleep.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think a lot of that also feeds into temperance, but okay.
Sure.
And I think the big thing, our point of disagreement.
So you pulled up a definition of prudence. Why don't you? Yeah, I think you should read that.
Absolutely, 100%. So there's 3 definitions here. The first one doesn't help us very much, but we'll say it anyway because it uses the word prudent in it. The quality or fact of being prudent.
Okay.
Thank you, dictionary.com. Pop-up ad. Or wise in practical affairs, as by providing for the future.
Okay.
Caution with regard to practical matters, discretion, and then regard for one's own interests. Now, I think what you're saying is your understanding of prudence is one that has a higher motivation for it, one that is the good, one that has...
Yeah, I mean, in all virtue, right? I don't think that's specific to prudence.
There you go. I think if we're able to just take the virtue of prudence as a virtue, maybe disregard it from any type of Christian motivation, which is the good of another, because that is something that you have to.
But see, James, and I guess this is where I like, in theory, I understand what you're saying.
Uh-huh.
But then what separates virtue from anything? Like, I don't, to me, what separates virtue from what makes virtue so special, I suppose, or so important, is that there is like a pursuit of the good, and there's some sort of higher nobility to what the self is trying to accomplish. Because I think once you take that away, then it's just a bunch of mannerisms or habits, but they're nothing more than that. And because there's no value statement on those habits, that's all they are.
Mm.
I mean, I can be prudent and be a murderer then, right? Like
You'd be a really good murderer.
Right. But I could be...
Oh, that's the wrong word. You'd be a really effective murderer.
Yeah, I mean, and when you take out the value system, right, then who is to say what is owed to each person?
Yeah.
Right? So then there's no clear understanding of justice. It's very relative.
Justice is an interesting example because justice, I think, justice is one of the hardest virtues out there because it requires so many other different virtues and then a true understanding of values in order to actually truly be just. And most of the time, I feel like my understanding of justice is the one I struggle with most. However, let's not just to stay on prudence for just a little bit, and then we can jump back to the justice if we want. The understanding that I have of these 4 virtues, especially in regards to prudence, is that everyone can have them, and they are such that any type of difficult goal, any type of motive that is outside of oneself, is not capable of being met without them. So, for example, you couldn't be a good CEO of any company. Doesn't have to be. It could be the one that's destroying all the forests in the world, or melting all the polar ice caps, for example. But it's a difficult thing, a big goal to have to accomplish, and it's way harder than just tidying your room up. So, far beyond oneself in order to bring down all the polar ice caps. But the only way you'd be able to accomplish that goal is if you had most of these virtues: prudence, justice, temperance.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. I hear you. Yeah, I mean,
So I think that's one of the things that is very, very appealing about these virtues, because
but then if that's how we're going to assess this, right? I think it makes it impossible to say that DC does a better job of portraying virtue than Marvel, or that Marvel does a better job of portraying virtue than DC, because if it's just about the individual habits, then we're looking just at like a scorecard. You know what I mean? We're building a rubric, and we're saying whether it's a movie or a person or a machine, I suppose, or a scientist who's building a machine, right? We're just taking the scorecard and we're saying, how well do you meet these objectives? And I think that with virtue, again, what separates it from, because I mean, and I suppose this is what you're getting at. Virtue very much deals with self-mastery. And in order to succeed at anything, whether well-intended or something malicious, there has to be a level of self-mastery. And the virtues are the steps to take to master oneself.
I'd agree with that.
So if that's what you're trying to get at, then I suppose I agree. But it very much bothers me to take away to separate virtue from a value system.
Okay. Well, it's a steps. We're talking about a fictional worlds here, and if we're going to tell story, if we're gonna be assessing stories, and from my point of view, telling stories, there's nothing more interesting to me than someone who is completely well-intentioned, but his value system is completely wrong, and he's one of the worst villains of all time.
So again, I think we might need to hash out a few more ideas about Thanos, but let's keep running through our list.
Great. But can we agree that prudence is that he is prudent?
In the way that you're talking about it, yes, we can agree.
Okay. He's a prudent being. He's a prudent, I don't know, whatever, I forget.
Alien.
I forget what being he is.
So fortitude, I think a great definition is the ability to live virtuously, or if we don't want to use the word virtue, the ability to act with self-mastery when one is in a situation where there are temptations or where the other virtues are sort of under attack.
Yeah, the idea is a man full of fortitude is one that when the going gets tough, he keeps at it.
Yeah.
He does not keel over and stop working just because he's hungry, tired, it hurts, or whatever it is.
Right.
He's the athlete that's able to get up at 4 a.m. and run those 20 miles.
A great example of fortitude. Well, I don't know how people feel about war movies, but because I love
war movies. Yeah. Barnaby loves war movies. Right,
well, do you know where I'm going with this?
No.
Oh, well. I'm blanking on the name. It wasn't American Sniper, the one where the kid carries all those bodies and he refuses to use a gun.
Oh, you're talking about Hacksaw Ridge.
Yes, thank you. Hacksaw Ridge.
Barnaby knew it.
That's because Barnaby's great.
He is.
We should put him on camera. Anyway, yeah, Hacksaw Ridge, great example. You know, the kid is tired, and clearly he's probably somewhat scared. He doesn't have a weapon, and yet he forges on. I think that's a good example of fortitude.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm sorry I was distracted right there while I was putting Barnaby on camera. But yes, Hacksaw Ridge, that man is a completely he has mastered the virtue of fortitude.
Yeah.
And he has a supernatural motive, which is love of fellow man, which we can get to those virtues later on.
Right.
But these just as fortitude, and okay, is Thanos Does he have fortitude?
Yes.
100% he has fortitude. He's able to do that which hurts him the most in order to accomplish his goals.
Yes. Although I would, again, like to add the Andrew caveat that I'm agreeing based on the way that you have set up, that you have framed this conversation.
Yes. Which it irks me that that's that caveat. But maybe we'll circle back afterwards and kind of assess the framing of it, because I think it's a valid frame, 100% valid frame. But we can get back to it. Well, let's battle that out later.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then we have temperance.
Temperance. Okay. So temperance is the idea where you won't go too much into something because you temper yourself. You bring yourself back where you're like, okay, you assess the situation.
Temperance is the virtue that prevents one from being over exuberant
Yes.
in his or her pursuit of virtue.
In a pursuit of anything.
Yes, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. So,
Do you think Thanos practices temperance?
well, let's think about it. He doesn't kill Stark when he, like, there's that moment when he has Tony Stark and he doesn't kill him.
But do you think
There's
that's the virtue of temperance, or do you think that's something else?
He's in the middle of battle. He's in the middle of battle, and he's going to be killing a lot of people very soon anyway. But he doesn't. And another thing he does, every time he gets one of those gems, those Infinity Stones, he leaves immediately. He doesn't continue the battle. He knows, okay, I've made my objective, and he uses temperance to pull out immediately before anything can go wrong.
See, and earlier, I mean, and this is where it gets tough because it's hard. Like, they're usually in situations people are applying multiple virtues.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I think more of prudence than I do of temperance in both of those situations, and a little bit of fortitude.
But still, he does temper himself from the thrill of battle.
I suppose, but I also think he goes to such great lengths to get what he wants that
He is incredibly prudent.
So I Oh,
I'm
boy.
agreeing with you. Okay.
So I don't know. I don't think.
Okay, split decision on temperance.
Okay, that's fair.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're 2-1-1.
Okay.
I think he wins out.
I suppose if we're looking at it purely by numbers. But the other part of this, which we haven't talked about, is do you think that certain virtues are more valuable or more important than other ones? Or do you think they're all equally important
Of these four?
of these four? And I don't mean situationally, because I understand that in different situations, certain virtues are going to be more applicable than some of the other ones, and some or one of them may not be applicable at all in a certain situation. So I don't mean I mean, obviously we could take a certain situation and say these are the most relevant virtues and this one isn't or whatever. That's not what I mean. I mean, generally, if we're going for self-mastery.
For self-mastery.
Do you think that certain virtues, some of these virtues, or one of these virtues or whatever, is more important than some of the other ones?
I could change my mind because I haven't thought about this too much, but I don't think, if just for self-mastery, I don't think one is more important than the other. I think that if, in order to master oneself, you need each one as much as you need the other in order to accomplish that goal.
So,
did you have a thought when you were?
Well, I just I don't know how strongly I feel this way, but my intuition, and from the little bit of thought that I've given this question, I think that fortitude is more important. If I would say fortitude and temperance are more important than the other than prudence and justice, and probably fortitude at number 1 and temperance at number 2.
So Thanos has the number 1.
Or and again I flip flop, but I definitely think fortitude is the most important. But then prudence and temperance might be tied. But I definitely think fortitude is number 1, because I think that. Let's take the example of marriage. People take wedding vows, whether it's secular or religious, right? And the purpose or the point of wedding vows or I should say when wedding vows are most needed is not when things are going well. It's when things are not going well that couples ought to refer back to those vows.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an act of the will,
Mm-hmm.
not an act of passion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think fortitude gets at that idea that being virtuous or self-mastery is more so in the will than in the passions, at least for men. It might be different for women, but at least for men. And so I think that in order to be able to be prudent, temperate, just, you have to have fortitude, because when things get difficult, like anybody can master oneself when it's easy. If you're sitting in a bland room all day, surrounded by nothing but books, and you're not allowed to leave, what are you going to do to pass the time? You're going to read.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when it's like, hey, you can go outside and play, and not that that's even a bad thing necessarily.
Mm-hmm. But you've got more options open to you.
Right.
For good or evil.
Right. And so then it just begs the other question. Your world just got a little bit bigger. So now I can go outside and play. Now there are other kids. Now someone has hurt me. How do I act? Do I retaliate? Right? So I think fortitude, at least how I see it or think about it, fortitude is more so that, like, when you're talking about Thanos, for example, not killing Stark, he might be exercising temperance, prudence, justice, maybe all of them.
Not justice.
But my point is that the reason he is able to exercise prudence and or temperance is because he has fortitude. Because he's in a situation where it would be very easy to kill Stark. But it's his ability. Some might say it's an ability to reason, which might lean more towards prudence. But I would say the self-restraint is the tougher part. Thus, fortitude is the most important virtue. That would be my central claim.
Well, I would 100% agree that you can't do. I don't think there's much a man can do without fortitude. If a man doesn't have fortitude, he doesn't have much of a shot at accomplishing anything in this world. So I think that speaks to your point very well. However, I'm not 100% convinced that it makes it the most important thing, because if a man is going to be doing something good with all of that virtue, those other virtues that he has, then he might need justice in order to.
So let's not confuse the most important virtue as being the only virtue.
Oh, good. That's good.
Having one, like, just because it's the most important does not mean the other ones are not necessary. It just means that it's the most important.
Okay.
That's what I'm getting at.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting question, and I would I think that's a good one to ask viewers to tune in. We have an email list. Jump on that email list.
Send us your questions. Send us your thoughts. We'd love to hear them.
I'd be so curious to see what our listeners think about what is the most important of those four virtues.
Do you happen to know our email address, James?
You'll see it at the bottom of the screen.
Okay, so for those of you who are perhaps listening through a means other than YouTube, go on YouTube, find our podcast.
Or you'll see it on our iTunes or our website where you're listening to this.
Yeah.
I apologize.
We'll have it somewhere. Very visible.
But jumping back into the reason why we brought up Thanos, suppose if we are saying that justice within that frame is self-mastery. I'm sorry.
Fortitude.
If we're saying that virtue is self-mastery within that frame that we had created earlier.
Right.
That makes for the most interesting of characters because the conflict,
and this is again why I will concede in the way that you're talking about it, but why I refuse to let go of my nuance. The reason it's interesting is because the actions themselves are things that people value, because they help. Self-mastery is necessary for success.
100%.
The conflict, however, comes into play because his ends or his goals are not noble. So he is mastering himself for the sake of harm. So it's this internal conflict of having the right tools, but using them in the wrong way or for the wrong reasons.
I agree with that last part, but he does have the most efficient and wonderful of tools, and he's using them wrong. However, I'm not sure I agree with the noble part. Can you explain a little more what you're saying that he's not using it for a noble end?
He's not, so I guess I would say noble is maybe a little bit different than good.
Yeah.
I guess I think of good as trying to help people or improve quality of life for someone else or the world around one. But I think of noble as maybe like a musician composing a symphony, where it adds beauty.
Interesting.
But and this is right off the top of my head, folks. So I'm sure these aren't complete thoughts or complete definitions, but just intuitively, I would say noble pursuits are probably a little bit more aimed towards beauty, and some sort of higher good. Whereas I think that when we talk about good, we can talk about it in a very human way, but we can also talk about it in a divine way. But we're talking about good. We're just distinguishing between whether it's natural or supernatural. Whereas I think noble oftentimes leans towards the supernatural, but not in a way that is through action. Probably in a more creative way.
I just looked up the definition of noble. You mind if I read it real quick?
No.
Okay. Having or showing fine personal qualities or high moral principles and ideals.
Yeah, so maybe not so much. So maybe I'll retract what I was saying, and maybe it's not so much through a creative means,
Gotcha.
But I definitely think it aims towards the supernatural.
Okay.
Or the higher.
Yeah, that would be. I know we mentioned Aristotle earlier, and that is something that I think Aristotle would. It's an Aristotelian concept where he's talking about pursuit of the noble, that which is higher, above oneself, that elevates oneself. I think Plato also would have talked about this in his. When someone is learning self-mastery, he descends down into the cave and is able to become enlightened by his love of pursuit of knowledge, his philosophy, and which leads one to know what is the noble and pursue that in his daily life. And I apologize because I know that's a very oversimplification of what Plato or Aristotle would say, but I think that's kind of what you're saying a little bit.
Yeah, we're just trying to get at ideas here. We're not claiming to be philosophers.
So the idea that we have here is that Thanos fails because he does not have that understanding of what his of that higher end.
Yeah, I mean he's pursuing harm. So whether or not it's noble, it's definitely not good. Not only is it not good, it's bad.
And that's what makes him a villain.
Yes.
But it's not his vices that make him interesting. What makes him interesting is the fact that he is a prudent. He is a man of fortitude. He is all these different things that make him a strong character capable of doing great things.
I just think that you're talking about virtue in a very theoretical way. For example, would you describe Hitler as a virtuous man? If someone walked up to you at a bar and said, "James, was Hitler virtuous?"
Well, that's a little difficult because every single movie I've seen about Hitler always made him to be some very irritating little shrimp that yelled all the time. I know he did some pretty difficult things, but I've never seen how his virtue played into him accomplishing it.
Well, but he inspired a lot of people to do something.
See, the thing is that
to work towards a common goal.
From our perspective, the only way that at least I'm able to see him to do that is if I see him screaming and yelling at a podium for about 30 minutes and going,
That's how he was portrayed, right? But obviously there was some charm. I mean, like,
I just don't know how anybody saw charm in that.
but that's not necessarily what he was doing. That's just how. I mean, I have no clue. I wasn't alive. I'm with you. I only what I know about Hitler comes from history classes and movies.
Yeah. I mean, Inglourious Bastards, that's about all I know about Hitler. And
But my point is, I think that if we were to look at Hitler,
yes,
he probably has a lot of the same traits or similar traits to Thanos. And we would probably, like, if we're having this conversation about Hitler, like, we take out Thanos and put in Hitler, we would probably be having a similar conversation. But I refuse to say that Hitler was virtuous, because what he did was so horrendous and so evil.
I don't think you can say that we could take out Thanos and put in Hitler if you have no idea what Hitler did or how he was able to accomplish what he did.
Well, he knew, I mean, he got to where he put himself in a position to exterminate the people he felt were a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly there was some prudence.
Just he could have used imprudent means. It could have been a nation full of very angry people that wanted to take care of that wanted to kill all these Jews, and I don't know what the circumstances were behind that.
But regardless of what the circumstances were, he was able to take advantage of them.
It could have been blind, dumb luck put over on a very angry nation. I mean, unless we can turn this into a Hitler class and say, like, okay, this is how Hitler broke it apart.
All right.
I don't think I see people throw around this Hitler term. He's the
that is
Hitler.
True. That is true.
This is the Hitler. He's always.
Well, and I'm not saying Thanos is Hitler. I mean, I definitely think Thanos is like, again, minimal information about Hitler, but Thanos is probably more controlled as a person, or as a character. But I guess that's kind of my point too, right? Is that he's a character.
Yes.
And so when we look at real people,
yes,
I think that the reason you're comfortable saying that, and that I'm comfortable on some level agreeing with you, is because he is a character and he is fictional. I think if we look at real people and real circumstances, we wouldn't be so ready to say that so and so possesses virtue. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get at is I don't know what word to use, but I don't think it's virtue. I think it's something else. I think it's like they have the tools needed for self-mastery, but I don't think it's virtue.
Well, what about if we look at a good guy in the Marvel universe?
Well, I think we should look at someone in the middle first.
Okay, go for it.
I want to talk about Batman.
Okay, good.
Because I think Batman is fascinating.
You and me and everyone else. So yes. Do you want to break him up, or what do you think?
Well, I guess we've talked about Thanos and how he maybe possesses tools necessary for self-mastery. But again, I think that one of the things with Thanos is it's this portrayal of he's well-intended because he wants people to have a high quality of life, but his means of getting there are bad and evil, because he kills half the population. So I think it's a little bit different with Batman, because I think Batman is well-intentioned. Or excuse me, I guess I'm referring to the Christopher Nolan Batman.
Okay, great.
The
high quality Batman.
Yeah, so I think that Batman and Thanos are parallel in that they're both well-intentioned. But the means that they use to get there are not necessarily the best. Where I think Batman is different than Thanos is we have the character of Bruce Wayne. And so it's hard to, I think as an audience, it's hard to separate Batman and Bruce Wayne, because even in the films, and this is one of the reasons I love the Christopher Nolan portrayal of Batman, also because of how the villains get portrayed, but we see Bruce Wayne falling asleep at a board meeting because he's exhausted because he was up the night before fighting crime.
It's a great scene.
We see him with these bruises and these scratches, missing meetings, traveling all over the place, and that's a false pretense for what he's doing as Batman, right?
He's showing a lot of fortitude.
So, well, yes and no. I mean, that's the other thing with Batman is you get like glimpses of him being virtuous, and then you get glimpses of him acting with vice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Batman, the character, or Bruce Wayne, the character, really gets at the human struggle of trying to live virtuously.
Mm-hmm.
We all fail, we all fall down, but we just get back up and try to keep going. And it's kind of up and down.
Yeah. I think Batman, the Chris Nolan, okay, I said some harsh things about DC earlier, and that is taking out the Chris Nolan trilogy, because Chris Nolan has a far better understanding of virtue and vices as I see them.
And I think that's fair, because I think the Christopher Nolan Batmans are just on their own level. Like, I don't even think they're in the same sphere as these other superhero movies.
Yeah, once Chris Nolan stopped making DC movies, there hasn't been a Chris Nolan level movie since then.
Right.
And so when I was saying harsh things about Batman and Superman and the rest of the DC superheroes, I was talking about the Zack Snyder and Onward type. Now, talking about Chris Nolan's Batman, he is definitely prudent. He is definitely just. He's definitely a man of fortitude, and he definitely shows temperance. Because he's always at that point where he's going to kill someone, but he doesn't kill someone. He tempers himself just enough.
I don't know that he's just, though.
Oh, go ahead. How does he fail in justice?
Well, I don't necessarily think... I think violence is appropriate as a means of self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Batman can be too violent at times, which, and I guess that's also lacking in temperance, but that's, at least to me, that's what makes Batman such a fascinating superhero, is you see how the rage of Bruce Wayne,
just rage.
Well, yes, but. And I think what we're getting at now is the difference between intention and action. Because I think that oftentimes his rage or his anger is just, but what does acting with justice look like? I don't think the answer is violence necessarily. And I'm not saying that violence altogether is bad or not needed. I'm not a pacifist. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that in those individual moments, I think Batman can go too far. I don't think that not killing, and I don't know, even at the end of the first one, Batman Begins, he doesn't save Ra's al Ghul. He doesn't kill him, but he passively kind of does. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would say that wasn't just. I would, in fact, say that was unjust.
What should he have done now? Just pull him out?
Pull him out and, hand him over to the legal system.
Well...
Which was corrupt.
Yeah, I wish he would have gotten away with it, and that wouldn't have been very just.
Yeah.
So, okay. I think the part where Batman falls a bit is the 3 supernatural virtues. And I would disagree. I think he is a just man, at least as he's set up in the comics. When you look at his understanding of the state of affairs in Gotham City, when you look at what he knows will happen once he turns these men over to justice, to the justice system, there is no justice within it. And so therefore he has to met out his own form of punishment in order to accomplish justice. So Batman speaks to a lot of frustration that every man has.
Yes, which again I think is the emotion, I suppose, or the passion is just, but I don't think it's just for one man to be deciding how to define justice. I don't think one man gets to define his own legal system, because then you're playing by his rules of right and wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in most of the cases, you're right. And this is what's so interesting about the Chris Nolan trilogy, is because Chris Nolan realized that this was that this argument was out there that look, not one man should be able to decide justice, and so he was able to play upon that, especially in The Dark Knight Rises, the last of the three movies. He's able to say, look, no one man should decide what justice is, and almost paint Batman out to be the villain. However, in the world that
in the last one and the third one,
yeah,
you think he paints Batman to be the villain?
You could easily make the argument based upon the other arguments the characters have within the movie, by saying the exact same thing that you just said right now.
I don't agree. So if you would enlighten me, I would appreciate it.
I will, but let me just finish off
Sure.
the argument real quick. The idea here is that Gotham City is is set up to be such a fallen place. It is incredibly fallen.
Right.
Therefore, it doesn't matter if one is turned over to justice or not, because justice will not be served. The villain will just be out on the streets again. The level of corruption that Bruce Wayne sees within the city has gone to such a far state that he needs to install that level of justice. And what he's talked about, the scene that I'm talking about, where they basically mention your argument and then Batman's response to it. In the words of Harvey Dent, he says, when in ancient Rome, when the enemy is at the gates, the Romans would appoint one man to go out and meet justice and basically instill martial law until the crisis has been averted. Do you remember that scene where they're all at the table towards the beginning of Dark Knight Rises? Not Harvey Dent. Who was it? Maybe that was Dark Knight that they were saying it. Oh my gosh!
Dark Knight.
Mm-hmm.
I think Batman does look a little bit more like the villain.
Okay, you might have. I'm remembering.
If you're talking about the Dark Knight, then I would agree with you.
Okay,
but in the Dark Knight Rises, again, one of the things I love about the Christopher Nolan trilogy is I think that Christopher Nolan does a great job of showing sort of the transformation of Bruce Wayne and sort of like the lighter, more virtuous side of Batman. Whereas I think to me that's one of the fascinating things about the trilogy is that in the first one you really get the background in the story. You find out about where Bruce Wayne is coming from and sort of how he struggles to become Batman. I think it's a great exposition. In the Dark Knight, I think you see the darker side and you see the darkness that exists in Gotham City. And the question is how, kind of like in this time of church crisis, right? One of the reasons we wanted to talk about Batman is when Gotham is a mess and you see all this darkness, how am I called to respond?
Yes.
And the problem with the vigilante is we talked about the personal call to holiness in our intro podcast. You know, part of that is staying committed to the church. Now, I don't want to draw an analogy here between Batman and the modern day church crisis because I don't think one exists. But my point is that...
You mean between Gotham and the modern day church crisis?
Yeah, correct. Okay. But my point is that Batman deciding the rules to me would be like a lay person founding a new church or founding a new religion or changing the doctrine of Catholicism. And because I guess the question that we're begging here, right? To sort of continue with these parallel lines, even though they're not, we're forcing the parallel. It's not a natural parallel. Do you think that because I could see how people would turn away from the church, right? It's a very understandable emotional response. Do you think that people have lost respect for church authority as well as the morality of the Catholic Church? Because that to me would be the equivalent of justice in the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. Batman believes that Gotham City has lost all sense of justice and it's up to him to reinstate it.
The way I answer that is by saying Batman does not, and this is for me, the failing of Batman as a true hero and containing all the virtues is he doesn't have the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. He might have parts of some of them, but the big thing that he'd be missing would be faith and hope. That that and when you have that, when you're making an analogy like this to the church,
Right.
we have to rely upon the faith, maybe not in priests, but in the priesthood, not in the Pope, but in the papacy, if as founded by and led by the Holy Spirit. So you are going. That is really where we're going, where he falls apart, because I don't know ultimately why Batman.
But
keeps
he's
on
also
fighting.
not beholden, like in this mythical world or in this fantasy world. He's also not beholden to a higher being, like because it's a fantasy world, right? And the writers get to define the rules.
Mm-hmm.
Religion is not a part of this world. Now, maybe that exclusion is an intentional choice. But what I'm saying is that Batman or Bruce Wayne doesn't actively reject religion
Mm-hmm.
because it's just not shown.
Mm-hmm.
So my point is that it seems more like a choice of the writers to exclude it rather than the character making a conscious decision.
I thought Robin was from a religious orphanage.
I'm talking specifically about the Christopher Nolan Batmans.
Isn't that Dark Knight Rises? Didn't he come from a religious orphanage?
Oh, you mean Nightwing?
Well, the guy who's known as Robin in the Joseph Gordon-Levitt character.
Yeah, he doesn't become Robin though. I think he becomes Nightwing.
Well, they said Robin.
I think that's his name.
Yeah.
But I think
okay, that guy, Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
Anyway,
I'm pretty sure that was from, like, there is religion in these.
I mean, okay, and that's fair. I might have missed it. That's entirely possible.
Yeah. So I think up to that point, I think you're right. There was no religion that was shown. However, that was there. You can't say it wasn't if you have that, and we can fact check that later. But yes, but it would be good, I think, to at least state those three theological virtues.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe define them a bit, just so that we're as we lay out virtue.
So these are specifically, do you know? I don't know, and forgive my ignorance, folks. I don't know if they're generic Christian virtues or if they're specific to the Catholic faith.
Christian. They're generic Christian.
Yeah. So the three theological, so the cardinal virtues or the primary virtues, the four main virtues, however you know them, whatever you want to call them, we just talked about them. Fortitude, temperance, prudence, and justice are the tools that one uses to master oneself. Because it's only in the mastery of oneself that one is able to give oneself fully to something else or to someone else. It's part of the problem with an addiction, right? And so I think a great way to think about the importance of the cardinal virtues is it's like you're not, if you're an addict, then you need to get off your addiction so that you can have a clear mind to do other things. If you're not an addict, then you actively make choices to avoid addiction, so that you can pursue other things that are healthier and that you enjoy, etc. So the virtues are the things that help us do that, and emotionally, psychologically, and mentally, as well as spiritually. But if you want to take the religion or spiritual aspect out of it, they're also important for emotional and mental health, I would argue. The theological virtues, however, are not something that are self-contained. They're not something that man can achieve on his own. They are gifts from God, and they're up to God to dispense or to share with us.
And thus they're the Christian virtues. So you cannot expect someone who is not Christian to be following these because they are unique to the Christian faith.
And so the three virtues are faith, hope, and charity. Faith, simply belief in God, and we're, again, rudimentary definitions here. We're not trying to be too scholarly or intellectual. Hope, well, do you have a good definition of hope? Because I really don't.
I think I would just add faith, hope, and faith, hope, and love. So faith is belief in God and His church and His graces, all of these things that are revealed to be part of the Christian religion. Hope, belief in heaven, belief in the fact that of divine omnipotence, in divine what is the word?
Do you think it's belief in, or do you think it's believing that one will receive those things?
I think one follows the other. First, you believe that it exists, and then.
But you don't think the belief part falls under faith?
I think one feeds the other. Well, for example, here, faith. Both faith and hope pass away once you reach heaven.
So I don't know who said it, and I don't know if I'm quoting this exactly right, but it's something like faith turns to. Hold on, give me a second.
Sure.
There's a good quote that I like. I'll get it. You were saying. I apologize.
No. Oh yeah, faith and hope pass away.
Right.
Once you reach heaven, you see God, and therefore there's no need to have faith because it's there. And then there's no need to have hope because you are there. So faith and hope are both of those things that we have only while we're here on earth. So they do feed each other very much. So like one relies a lot upon the other.
So I'm probably not saying this exactly right. It's probably not the exact quote, but it's something like faith turns to reality. No, excuse me. Faith turns to sight, hope turns to reality, and charity is fulfilled.
Charity is still a virtue that is there. That it is as it is now.
Yeah, I mean, if someone gets to heaven, it's something. Again, it's something like faith. Faith turns to sight, hope turns to reality, and charity is fulfilled. Because there's no longer a need to believe, because God is in front of you, assuming you or the repose of your soul gets to heaven. Hope turns to reality because you're no longer hoping to get to heaven or hoping that heaven exists or hoping any of these things. It's there. And charity is fulfilled because there's no longer a separation between the soul and God.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm sure someone, I have a particular buddy in mind, can listen to this podcast and pick this apart and tell us where we're wrong, but that's not what we're trying to get at.
Don't worry about that. So
but I just want our viewers to have a sense of where we're coming from.
So the hope, the greatest of the three is love, is charity, is that force that is God that binds.
And that's
us
directly
together.
from Scripture.
Yes, absolutely. So when I look at Batman, the thing that I really have a problem with is I can understand someone who contains the virtues of faith and hope continuing on despite all the problems that the incredible indignities that he suffers and pain and just to continue forward. But I don't understand. I can understand someone with these Christian virtues of faith and hope continuing on because I have the knowledge of the story of Christ who did this thing. But I don't know why Batman continues on, and that's one of the problems that I think there's
That's fascinating to me because I think it's so obvious.
Why?
I think he is fueled by his anger, and that to me is like what drives a lot of his vice, and that's why I'm reluctant to say that he acts with justice because I think at times he's so enraged that it's an emotional response rather than a just response.
Mm-hmm. I've never defined Batman as someone who's fueled by his anger in all of those darkest moments because anger runs out when you're at the lowest point. What makes you rise?
And that again, that's what makes The Dark Knight Rises so fascinating. And one of the aspects to Batman that I love and think is really intriguing and very well written in the Christopher Nolan trilogy is that Batman is a loner, and I think that his isolation and his despair and his anger and his I think all these things are connected, and that's what fuels him to keep going. And I think he feels, if we're going to compare and contrast The Dark Knight to The Dark Knight Rises, I think in The Dark Knight you sort of see how he's forced to remove himself from those human connections because he feels like he's the only one who can adequately stand up for the city. And there's sort of this interplay of what you were talking about where he kind of seems like the villain, but at the same time, he lets everyone think that he killed that he killed Harvey Dent and harmed all those people because he understood that Harvey Dent being the hero was more important to Gotham City than for Gotham City to know the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And then in The Dark Knight Rises, you see Bruce Wayne, Batman, sort of like relax a little bit more. And you see him find those human connections, whether it's reconnecting with Alfred or dating Catwoman at the end of the film. You know, or even his brief romance with what's her name, who was the mastermind,
Ra's al Ghul's daughter.
Yeah,
Talia.
Yeah, you know, so you see how he goes from driving away Rachel because he refuses to give up Batman, and you know, it's like, hey, this is what I do, and it's a question of, is this my identity that I'm hiding behind,
mm-hmm.
or is it really necessary?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which I think that's one of the questions posed in the Dark Knight. And then in The Dark Knight Rises, I think that question kind of gets answered by saying it, and see, in The Dark Knight Rises, and this is again why I think Christopher Nolan was so brilliant in how this whole thing got written and constructed. In The Dark Knight Rises, Batman had nothing to do with the problems of the city. I mean, he had disappeared for, you know, however long, 20 years or 30 something, some amount of years, right? And then he tried to fight. His back literally got broken. He heals it in a jail cell under the guidance of a guru, right? And the way he overcomes is by facing his fear directly. Because the guru character tells him the reason the child made the jump is because the child didn't have a rope.
Mm-hmm.
So what does Bruce Wayne do? He jumps without a rope. And I think that speaks to what our faith should look like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even in our most desperate situations where we're really not sure, we have to jump without a rope. And we have to trust. And I think that it's, again, fortitude is necessary because it's when it's most difficult that it's oftentimes most important. Like right now, with what's going on with the scandals.
Mm-hmm.
It can be very difficult to turn towards God, to make that jump without a rope. And yet, it is so important when things are most unclear.
It's absolutely necessary. I think that the question that I have is, well, what are we saying? What jump are we supposed to be making? Where should we be going when we're jumping? I mean, it's one thing to know that we're climbing out of a pit, but what pit do we climb out of? Where do we go?
I mean, I think that the answer to that question is in Scripture. And I think that there are still a lot of priests that can be trusted, and turning towards them. I think community, you know, it's something we haven't talked too much about, but I think community is another, which is why it's important to have friends that have similar values, because I think community is another outlet to talk to people of similar ages, people who are older and have a little bit more life perspective, people who are younger and maybe need a little bit more guidance. I think they're, you know, can learn something from everyone. And so I think that there's a way to sort of stay connected to people, help them, they help you, feed off of each other. And at least for me, like all these different interactions, a bunch of different experiences breed new ideas and breed a new way of looking at things, or maybe add a depth to something I was already aware of. And so I think that there's always the external, right? but I think the best response is prayer.
Prayer, and then to take that analogy of jumping without the rope, jump into the virtue. Like we've laid out here prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, and given you crude definitions of each. And then the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. There's so much there that one can unpack within these. If we can jump without a rope into these ideas, look at some of the writings Aristotle has on the virtues. Check out Orthodoxy by Chesterton. Check out Lewis's The Three Loves. And there's so many different things that we can find out about virtues that can impact our life, our day-to-day life, and our understanding of them. I think the encouragement to look inwardly, like we said in our first episode, but also to jump without the rope that we said today in this episode, jump into these ideas of virtues. Find out how you can be that better man.
Right.
I love the analogy of jumping without a rope. I want to do that in my own life, and I think the
well, and I think that's, I mean, you and me both, you know.
Yeah.
I feel like we need this lecture for ourselves.
Yeah.
Probably more so than any of our listeners do, you know.
We can't do anything great in life without prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. We can't do anything with these tools that is actually helpful to God and his king. Not helpful to God, that is totally wrong. That is actually pleasing to God without faith, hope, and love. So there's so much that we can grow at as Catholic men, as Christian men, with these virtues.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The only thing I would say though is that I think the theological virtues, right, because they're gifts from God, they can overcome vice, and they can overcome a lack of the cardinal virtues. In the same way that just because someone is virtuous doesn't mean that person possesses the theological virtues.
Well, I think it's written in Scripture, love covers a multitude of sins.
Yep.
And so, yeah, you have a good point there. But to kind of bring things back into what we were saying before, there is a common misconception about virtue that we need to refute in our day-to-day life, that virtue is bland, that virtue is not interesting.
Or let's say it is. Let's say it is bland.
I won't. But go ahead.
That's fine.
But go ahead, you say it.
But let's pretend it's bland. Let's pretend it's not interesting. Let's pretend it's not romantic.
Okay.
Who cares? Do it anyway.
Why?
Well, actually, that's a fair question. And I guess to me, it's something that I want, and it's something that's intuitive for me, which is that I would rather live a meaningful life than an easy life.
True. 100%.
And to me, oftentimes, the harder something is, the more important it is, the more meaningful it is. And those are the situations where I tend to become a better person and a better man, having gone through them.
And I agree 100%.
Those experiences.
But a meaningful life is more interesting. And if you are pursuing virtue, you will have a more meaningful life, and that, therefore, a more interesting one.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm speaking to more so is not the sort of global perspective. I'm speaking more so to the monotony of the routine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they never show Batman's training regimen.
They don't show him waking up at 6 a.m. They don't show him brushing his teeth.
Yeah.
They don't show him eating healthy, skipping dessert. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, that's the stuff they don't show. In fact, I read an article a few years back that talked about how the Rocky montages ruined America because it made everything seem so easy and so accessible. Because it's, these 60 to 120 second clips of super intense work, and then he's there, he's in shape, he's conquered himself. But that's not how it works, and that's why I think it's all the little things.
Mm-hmm.
Again, going back to our intro podcast, it's doing the right things on the day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm.
That like that's where virtue is formed mostly, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's sum it all up, good buddy, huh?
Yeah. So what did we talk about today, James?
So today we looked at how DC does not understand vice and virtue, and Marvel does.
Except for the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy.
And how virtue is necessary for an interesting and meaningful life, and it can be accomplished by an understanding of faith, hope, and, let's not prioritize. By an understanding, a virtuous life and a meaningful life can be accomplished by an understanding of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, and crowned with faith, hope, and love. So go live it.
Yeah, go live it.
Barnaby, how'd we do today?
You did good.
Barnaby, what did we miss? What are your thoughts?
It was a good discussion. It was great. It was I think they're really interesting topics. The ideas of values and virtues, they're interesting, and I think it's it makes me think, as in the context of a good man is hard to find. Defining a good man, what is a good man? And I think virtue has a lot to do with it. And I think it's interesting defining the difference between those virtues of self-mastery against the virtues we hold within faith, within the context of theology and faith and hope and love. And I think it's interesting the way those three, faith, hope, and love, influence the way fortitude, temperance, and prudence, and justice, the way you view them. So for me, I feel like I view those virtues very differently because of my virtues and values of faith. Within the context of my beliefs, I feel like that directly influences the way I work towards these other virtues in my life.
As well they should.
Yeah.
100%. I mean, you look at the life of a Christian, of a virtuous Christian, and it is complete. It needs to have a different flavor than the life of a virtuous pagan. And we're not saying that a pagan is bad or anything like that, but if you don't have the virtue of faith, hope, and love, there is going to be less joy. And even if you are 100% virtuous with those cardinal virtues, you will be missing out on so much joy that our Christian faith brings. And it's not all joy, but it's one example of it. There's a different flavor to a virtuous man, a virtuous Christian.
Which I think, and thanks for your thoughts, Barnaby. I think that's really insightful. But I think it also speaks to the importance or the volume of conversation to be had around virtue.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely think this is a topic that going into this episode, we had already talked about this, but I definitely think it's something that we should revisit at some point, because I feel like there's a lot we didn't touch on that we need to.
Well, let's do it. But that'll be a conversation for another day.
In the meantime,
follow us on Instagram, or you can follow me on Instagram, jp2.anu. Also check out barnabycoxon.com. You can see all of the great stuff. Also,
he's the reason we sound like angels, folks.
And also check out on our website, goodmanpod.com. You're going to see a tip jar. Please tip. That's Barnaby's tip jar. So leave a nice tip, would you, folks? And how can we follow you, Andrew?
Oh, you don't need to follow me. I don't really have any social media. But reach out, send us questions to our email address, which will be posted under the link or above the link somewhere, easy to see on our YouTube page. It'll be on our website.
Like, comment, subscribe, follow our email address, all that good stuff. Until next time, I'm James Pinedo.
I'm Andrew Klinsky. And remember, be patient.
Because a good man is hard to find.